German Nationalism Examiner Report. To do well in Section A, candidates need to explain the view of each interpretation to the question and evaluate the interpretation by the application of contextual knowledge. Responses should be shown an understanding of the wider debate connected to the issue. To do well on Section B, candidates need to make connections and links across the whole period, explaining similarities and differences between the events they are discussing, shown awareness of continuity and change across the whole period unless instructed otherwise. The comparisons made may be either between periods or within topics or regions. The strongest answers will test the hypothesis and reach a supported judgment. Candidates who did well showed a clear understanding of the views between the interpretations in relation to the question, were able to use contextual knowledge to test the interpretation, linking that knowledge directly to the interpretation through evaluative words, were able to consider both strengths and limitations using contextual knowledge in answering the essay questions, covered the whole period in a balanced way, adopted a thematic approach, made links and comparisons between the topic, explained the links and comparisons, it supported their arguments with precise and relevant examples, reached a supported judgment about the issue in question, demonstrated an understanding and familiarity with the command verbs, e.g. identify, describe, explain, and discuss. Students who did less well showed limited understanding of one or both interpretations, did not go beyond basic explanation of part of the interpretation, did not link contextual knowledge directly to the interpretation, therefore did not evaluate the interpretation. In answering the essay, adopted a chronological approach rather than a thematic approach, did not make links or comparisons even if events from different parts of the period were discussed in the same paragraph, not cover the whole period, did not focus on the precise wording of the question, made unsupported comments about issues where there were no more assertions. Question 1. Evaluate the interpretations in both passages and explain what you think is more convincing as an explanation of the nature of constitutional developments within the German state from 1687 to 71. Most candidates did grasp passage A, arguing the Liberals would find much to admire in the German constitution, and even so the North German Confederation, but there was some confusion over passage B's argument about the role of particularism, with some mistakenly thinking it was arguing for Bismarck and Prussian domination over the process. Stronger candidates brought in their knowledge of the 1867 to 71 period as Southern States military alliance with Bismarck and the details of the 1871 Constitution, while events outside the period, such as the 1848 revolutions and the culture camp, could be made relevant. References to the Vienna settlement or Weltpolitik were less useful. Weaker responses struggled more with the passages and showed less developed knowledge of the constitutional events in this period. Question 2. Intellectual forces only played a limited role in the creation of German nationalism throughout the period of 1789 to 19. How far do you agree? Strong candidates benefited from an explanation of how they were defining influential forces in the essay and how these forces changed and developed through the period. Some usefully divided their essay into the creation of German nationalism so they can compare the role of intellectual forces to other at the time. Those were determined to divide the essay into multiple themes such as political, economic, cultural, military, and xenophobic nationalism sometimes produced a very convoluted and tricky argument to follow. Some candidates made the assumption that the illiterate peasants and labourers could have used nationalistic feeling simply because they did not know how to read the works. This often followed by the claim that better education allowed anti-Semitic, xenophobic nationalism to develop later in the period. Weaker candidates knew little about intellectual forces, and even those that did sometimes assumed that they played no role at all after the 1848 revolutions. Question 3. Metternich was more effective in managing German nationalism than Napoleon, Bismarck, or Wilhelm II. How far do you agree? This was the most popular of the essay questions and produced some excellent responses, which used themes such as political, cultural, and military nationalism to compare the full rulers' successes over the period. Some defined what they understood by managing German nationalism in their introductions, which was an effective way to compare the desperate figures of which different aims, such as Metternich and Bismarck, for example. Some candidates chose to address individual minister/ruler in a separate paragraph, and this approach seldom got a level 4, although some synthesis in the conclusion could tip it to the bottom of the level 5. Weaker responses often left Napoleon out completely and had little to say beyond the describing the careers of the three most often at some length and with little attempt to judge how effective they were in managing German nationalism. Question 4. German nationalism had mass support only at times of war. How far do you agree with the view between the period of 1789 to 1919? This was the least popular essay question, but there are some very good answers that both recognise that wars did not only engender mass support for German nationalism, the Austrian-Prussian War, for example, and that mass support was also seen during peacetime, the 1848 revolutions, the 1814 Rhine crisis, and the popularity of the Navy and Pan-German leagues, for example. However, weaker responses often left out the periods of fighting between Napoleon and the wars of unification in the 1860s, and had a very little to say outside of Bismarck's wars and the outbreak of World War I. There was also occasionally the lack of focus on mass support, and essays became a chronological description of development of German nationalism during this period.